Well, today we're going to be talking about modernist literature and just kind of the movement of modernism in general and how that came about and developed, and obviously the impacts it had on literature. So first thing, as you can see in this opening slide, is to point out is that modernism is not merely a literary movement, but it had an impact in architecture, art, and various types of philosophy and such. And so it's kind of a broad movement that, like many of these other ones we've spoken about, that has a lot of impacts across society and culture. All right, so to start, we're going to go ahead and recap what came before modernism, at least in the literary sense. So we talked about Romanticism and kind of the idea of passion over reason and imagination over analytical reason, or at least valued more in analytical reason, maybe a little bit less than in the Enlightenment era. This, the concept of the romantic individual, and also literature that is made for and uses the language of the common people. And kind of out of Romanticism, modifying elements of it, and also kind of hearkening back to some elements of the Enlightenment, we get Victorianism. Carries kind of from the Romantic movement and this idea of progress and development, and kind of that sort of organic thinking about the world. But it also somewhat modifies it. You get realism, as opposed, as the reading I gave y'all indicates, the Victorians were a little less convinced of the truth of imagination and emotion, and tended toward to kind of modify some of that, even while they do keep this idea of progress. At least a lot of them do. So you get realism, and then particularly in the later Victorianism, you get kind of this mechanistic materialism, where they're kind of hearkening back to the old Enlightenment project of seeing the world in sort of machine terms, if you will. All right. So the end of the Victorian era is kind of unique. The 1890s through 1914, where like any movement in literature and culture, there's always kind of an open question as to, when is the beginning of this movement and when is the end of it, and it's never just a real cut and dried sort of thing. So some people will call modernism pretty much starting with 1900. Pretty much everybody agrees that World War I and after is what we would call modernism, but the beginning part of it is a little bit fuzzy. Some people would call this period sort of late Victorianism, or the Edwardian age, and there's all sorts of different names and such for this era. However, we do see some things that kind of develop out of and challenge some of the ideals of the Victorian era. For example, the Victorians a lot of times really had this idea of, art needed to have a didactic and teaching purpose, that the artist was kind of like a prophet who had, a moral duty to society and such. During this era, like the 1890s through beginning of World War I, you get the rise of this idea of art for art's sake, that art's only goal is really just to be beautiful and be good art. It doesn't need to have some sort of overarching moral and didactic purpose. Naturalism also rises, and naturalism is a lot of times associated with one of the types of materialism that are becoming popular at this time. Sometimes it's associated with Marxism, but not always. But naturalism tends to take this view of the human as sort of being a helpless pawn of natural forces. It's usually a pretty dark and depressing sort of view, but it sees the human as kind of moved around by impersonal forces that they don't really have power over, and calls into question the idea of humans as free actors and such. Imperialism, this is really the height of European imperialism during this time period. And you have all sorts of reactions to that in literature, some, kind of supporting it and some very critical of it. But, the fact of imperialism is very important. You see, at least, connected to English literature, you see the English language spreading very widely, and the rise of other literatures in English outside of the UK. I mean, obviously, American literature had already been going for a while at this point, but you see the rise of, literatures in other English-speaking areas as well as, English starts to spread. Religious skepticism. The early and mid-Victorians, not, just like anything else, there are people at all different belief systems and such, but they tended on the whole to be more religiously devout, whereas this time the upper class of Great Britain becomes, not all of them by any means, but a lot more of them become religiously skeptical. And some of them turn to kind of, turn to atheism or various forms of materialism, but a lot of them also turn towards kind of the occult and spiritism. That becomes very popular among a lot of the upper class in the UK and maybe to a lesser extent America, but also there as well. And you see really this rise of new ideologies. I've already mentioned Marxism a couple times, but that really starts coming to the fore at that point and becoming kind of the dominant form of socialism. Because socialism, it predates Marxism. There's a lot of different types of socialism, but Marxian socialism really becomes the dominant form kind of during this time period. Extreme nationalism. This is, along with educating the masses, also comes the idea of indoctrinating the masses, if you will. And nationalism becomes very widespread in, Europe and America as well, in a pretty extreme form. And then, of course, also quote unquote scientific racism. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that a pretty large majority of Europeans and Americans at this time held the belief that, some races were just, if you will, naturally superior to others and such. And that was not, a fringe thought at the time. It was probably pretty much the dominant belief. And it underlay, of course, a lot of the whole imperial project and of imperialism and stuff. You had different flavors of it. You had some that were kind of more of the paternalistic, well, these poor benighted, quote unquote, benighted races need to be brought along to maturity by those of us who are a little further along. And then, of course, you have at the other end of it, stuff like the Nazis who are just kind of straight up, we should just murder everybody who's less than us and such. And so you have all sorts of different shades of that, but some form of this is pretty common at the time. In fact, I'd say pretty well a dominant idea at the time. Not by any means everyone, but a lot of people, and probably the majority. Okay, so that's all coming into the fore pretty much during this time period. And then cataclysm happens, World War I. It's sparked in part by imperialism and extreme nationalism. But even more importantly than what sparked it off, a lot of the imperialism and extreme nationalism lead it to dragging on so long and being so completely brutal as it was. Because, before, if you'd had a war where people are losing the kind of numbers that they are, your government wouldn't have had enough wealth to continue the war. They would have just had to sue for peace because they ran out of money and stuff like that. But with this mass mobilization from mass media and extreme nationalism and stuff like that, it's kind of like the whole nation is being fed into the meat grinder instead of just the king's pet project and such. And calling it a meat grinder is pretty accurate. I mean, if you're familiar with World War I, it's a lot of just sitting in trenches and shooting each other and dying by poison gas. It was very brutal and very dehumanizing, and so you get just this kind of shattering of this idea of progress that had been very dominant during the Victorian era, where people start to really question, okay, so if our progress in science and technology has led to us having really efficient machine guns, is that really progress? If our progress of being able to come together as one people has led to us, well, running into collision with another people who are just as convinced of this and trying to kill each other off, is that really progress? Are we really progressing morally when we don't seem to be able to get out of this clash that's just grinding up whole countries and whole generations basically? And so it really leads to this mass disillusionment in the sense that basically what we've been doing doesn't work. And in a large part of Europe, it just ends in chaos and revolution. We're a little bit insulated from that in the United States. In some ways, we'd kind of had our sort of comparable one a generation before with the Civil War, or a couple generations before with the Civil War. But in a lot of Europe, World War I is just utterly devastating. The United States doesn't get in until towards the end, and it's far less costly as far as number of people affected and stuff in the U.S. But even there, it has a pretty huge impact. But in large sections, Russia only gets out of World War I because they have a revolution in another war, Civil War. Germany, only sues for surrender after their government gets overthrown. And in a lot of Europe, it just ends in kind of basically chaos and such. And so it leads to this, between the world wars period. Now, this era is often called the era of high modernism. Like a lot of the most characteristically modernist works of literature are written during this time period, and this is really when a lot of the ideas of modernism are on full display. Post-World War II, things do change, and we start to see this shift towards what will later be known as postmodernism. But between the wars, this is really when modernist thought is at kind of in full flower. So what's going on politically and such? Well, you got the Russian Civil War that ends up in a communist takeover. So yeah, if you're in Russia, you didn't really get much of a break. You went straight from World War I, and Russia lost more people in World War I than any other country, to a civil war that's also very brutal and bloody. And then the communists take over, and they're purging people, so it's just nonstop. It's pretty awful. In the United States and in the cities, you do have the quote unquote roaring 20s, but it's really important to keep in mind that that is really only the US and it's really only the cities. Rural America, which keep in mind at this point is almost half the population, is not doing so well. American agriculture had done very well during World War I because we were selling food to all the combatants. After World War I, they had a major downturn. And so Americans in rural areas are actually not doing that well. But for some people in the cities are making vast amounts of wealth really fast and, developing this new sort of, the whole flapper lifestyle and all that kind of stuff that's going on and the rapid technological changes. So, at least some parts of society in America, it seems like, wow, stuff's really roaring along. But once again, that's only some parts and really mostly just in America. Most of the rest of the world's in pretty bad shape, particularly Europe. Europe's all torn up. England or the UK has lost pretty much an entire generation of young men, and it's just shattering. And that shows up in the literature. If you've ever read something about, say, like the poetry of Wilfred Owen, it really becomes evident, or Siegfried Sassoon and some of the other World War I poets. And there's just this sense, once again, of just mass disillusionment. Then, of course, even in the U.S., then we have the collapse and we have the Great Depression, which for the U.S. is kind of like this reversal, at least parts of it, of progress, of prosperity. But in a lot of the world, it's just kind of like one more thing added because they've already been in pretty bad shape. And so, you see people respond to this dislocation in a couple different ways. And Germany and Japan and Italy, to some degree at least, you see this rise of militarism where we're going to solve this by taking out our problems on others. But then in, say, The UK and France and some other places, it's more, well, whatever happens, we don't want another war. So they're willing to kind of appease the militarists. And of course, we know that doesn't work out very well in the long run. And as I already kind of mentioned at the beginning, this is really the era of what's called high modernism. There's the bell. When a lot of this modernist thought is really in full flower. All right, so then we to the Second World War. And like I said, for a lot of Europe, it was just kind of one long running disaster from 1914 all the way through the end of World War II. So they didn't have that sort of intra-war prosperity during the 20s like the US did. So, but the war grind, war starts back up again. And, we have even further horrors like the Holocaust, where you talked about kind of that scientific, quote unquote, scientific racism thing. And of course, the ultimate fruit of that in many ways is the Holocaust, which, by the way, is a lot of the reason that it becomes discredited. Keep in mind that there were plenty of people in the UK and the US and a lot of other places that were perfectly fine with that when they see it in its full flowering in under the Nazis, they kind of step back and say, whoa, maybe that's not a good ideology. They start questioning things and such. So, of course, World War II leads to a major rearrangement of the world. And instead of the multiple great powers before, it really just leaves two. I mean, sort of three, because the British Empire is still somewhat powerful and hangs on, but it fades pretty quick and just leaves really the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, at least most of the developed world lines up in one of two armed camps behind one of those two competing visions of the world. There's further disillusionment. There's we already see some of this in the war poetry of World War One, but this idea of kind of the survivor narrative that we've got to tell the story of the horrors so it doesn't happen again, with Holocaust narratives and stuff like that. We also see rise in like a philosophy of absurdism and things like that, where it's like the world just doesn't make sense, so let's kind of just accept that it doesn't make sense and make a literature of how much it doesn't make sense and such. We also see a breakdown of at least explicit imperialism. There's some ways that imperialism kind of never went away, but at least countries openly having colonies that are being directly exploited by the colonial country and stuff like that. Both the US and the Soviet Union are hostile toward that. And so that, and also, well, the colonial powers just being exhausted by war, leads to most colonial empires pretty rapidly breaking down after World War II. So, who are the important thinkers of this era? Now, I'll point out that a number of these really, lived before the era covered, and when we're talking about modernism, they're more kind of late Victorian characters, but they had a huge impact on modernism. So, of course, first there's Marx. We're familiar with, kind of his economic ideas, but it's important, I think, to keep in mind that his economic ideas come from his philosophical ideas, and he probably saw himself as at least as much of a philosopher as a economist of some sort. And pretty central to his idea is that culture and society are just kind of like basically outgrowths of material reality. That the most basic and fundamental thing is these people have stuff and those people don't, and they want stuff, and that culture and society and everything else just is kind of like a superstructure built on that. And he believed that revolution and overthrowing what he saw as unfair unfair exploitation was just he believed it was just going to happen. It was destined to happen, and that Marx, that this classless society that he envisions is just kind of the natural way that things are going to go and such. So anyway, that was a lot of his thought and such. Darwin, of course, is hugely important, not only in science, which he's very important in science and his He's the one who really starts, at least provides a lot of the fundamental ideas of modern evolutionary science and such. But it's important also to remember that a lot of people took his ideas in science and kind of made a philosophy of it in some ways that, Darwin himself may have not been okay with. A lot of the quote unquote scientific racism pulled some ideas from Darwin and kind of ran with it in some pretty wild directions. And also, you have this idea of different nations almost being kind of like different proto species of different ways of looking at things. And this kind of survival of the fittest a lot of times gets gets used in both by, say, Marxists and, the really hardcore capitalists, both in their own sort of ways and such. And so a lot of these ideas really from that are derived from some or inspired by Darwin, although I wouldn't necessarily say by any means a necessary outgrowth of his ideas, but they come to the fore in many different ways. Nietzsche, once again, kind of before the modernist era, if you will, but hugely influential. He, a lot of his concepts are that, basically morality and society and, the way things work as we know it actually don't work anymore, and we're just and he argues that, stuff like that there is no real innate nature to, say, our moral code and stuff like that, and that basically what we think of as moral rules are pretty much just some rules that some group in the past imposed on everybody else because they're really powerful, and that he sees like the really great individuals of history, the Übermensch, as he calls them, are just, they're people who pretty much live above and beyond all these rules and kind of set the rules for others and that sort of thing. So, but basically that morality as we see it is for the most part just kind of a creation of whatever class or group happens to impose their will on others. So he sees really the will as being kind of the central element of humanity as opposed to, like morality or reason or something like that, that he thinks that most of those things are just kind of outgrowths of very powerful groups or individuals imposing their will on others, and it shows up in different rules and stuff. So obviously he has a huge impact on, well, the Nazis think they're Übermensch. There's some people that argue that Nietzsche probably would have actually hated the Nazis, and I don't know if that's the case or not. I do know that the Nazis at least thought they were Nietzscheans. Um, and he also has a huge impact on the later development of what would become postmodernism later on. But this idea of, the systems that worked before don't work anymore has a huge, that's a big thing during the modernist era. We've got Freud, who actually was writing during this time period and such. And Freud is, although his actual ideas about how the mind works are largely discredited today, he was historically very important for a number of things. For one, he really brings up this idea of the unconscious, that basically we have a lot of what's going on and what moves us is not conscious, is kind of under the surface unconscious things that are drives and such. And of course, as you probably know, he thinks that most of that's tied to the sexual drive in some way or another. That's actually probably one of the more controversial things. Like people almost immediately disagree with it, but it does have a big impact on society. Certainly later on in the 60s with the whole sexual revolution, but there was kind of a before that sort of sexual revolution in the 20s too, that's also very much impacted and inspired by Freud and the idea of repression and all this kind of stuff. So the ideas of the id, this ego and the superego that were kind of pushed along by drives that we try to control with the ego, and then the superego of feeling we're in power, and then the superego of sort of societal expectation and all. Like I said, a lot of his individual theories have been, or probably most of them, been largely discredited, but he does spark a lot of new directions in looking at the way we are motivated and we think and stuff. And then, of course, there's Einstein, and not just Einstein, but really all the new physics that comes to the fore in the early 20th century that kind of overturns the knocks over the fruit basket of Newtonian physics and that whole kind of relatively mechanistic way of looking at the world, and says, no, the world doesn't really work like that. I don't claim to be enough of a scientist to be able to thoroughly explain a lot of Einstein's ideas, particularly not in a short thing like this. But I will say that his concepts like relativity and the nature of particle science that he and others at this time and quantum physics and such like that Einstein and the other physicists at the time, they have a huge impact overall on kind of reworking the way we think the world works and such, and big impact on the modernist writers and such too. So let's talk about literary modernism now. We'll talk about some precursors that kind of have an impact in the modernist era. Well, we've got Walt Whitman. He's a writer of the mid to late 1800s in America. Walt Whitman is really the first major poet that very extensively uses free verse, at least in English. Most poetry before then, there have been some examples of free verse, but the vast majority of poetry before then had at least some sense of meter and rhythm, regular meter to it. That was just kind of what they thought made poetry, if you will. And so Whitman's very experimental verse forms and kind of free verse poetry is rather unique at the time, and it's kind of controversial. Not only that, his subject matter offends a lot of people. He could be a little more frank in talking about sexuality and such than was considered appropriate at the time, although today he'd be considered fairly tame still. He's also known as the poet of democracy, where he celebrates this. A lot of literature before it had a fairly kind of elitist, we're writing for a smaller class. I mean, with the Romantics, you see a move away from that, but you see Walt Whitman really latch onto this idea of, I'm writing for and as the voice of the masses, if you will. G.M. Hopkins, or Gerard Manley Hopkins, he's a poet. He's actually a Jesuit priest. He is English. He moves to Ireland and works in Ireland for most of his later life. Dies at a fairly young age, actually. But he was pretty well unknown. He's writing in the 1870s and 1880s. He's pretty much unknown at the time. But he gets discovered around, I think, towards the end of World War I, and his poetry gets published and has kind of big impact. But he does a lot of experimentalism with different verse forms, where he shows, he still does have sort of a meter, but he plays around with it a lot, where instead of having, regularly varied strong and weak stresses, he more just says, okay, we're going to have X many stresses per line and stuff like that. And he also really plays with this idea of linguistic purity, of trying to use as much English that derives from Anglo-Saxon, not completely. I mean, he uses some words that come from French and Latin too, definitely. But he tries to give it this feel of almost, language that kind of is primally English and isn't really borrowing verse forms, but is trying to derive its structure and its feeling from the way English actually works, instead of, kind of using verse forms from other languages, which had been very, very common throughout English literature. In France, we have Charles Baudelaire, who is kind of the founder of the French symbolist movement in poetry. He is, he has all sorts of very deep and kind of spooky allusions in a lot of his poetry. He's actually influenced a lot by Edgar Allan Poe, he and the symbolists in general. And so you get kind of this sort of spooky and very symbolism that has multiple and kind of mysterious meanings in it. He's also known as a decadent poet, and that these are poets who are kind of living the rock star lifestyle, if you will, burning the candle at both ends and doing all the sex and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of them actually, at the end of their life, turn from that because they find it's kind of a dead end. It's kind of an interesting pattern you see in a lot of these guys. But the decadent poets sort of latch onto this art for art's sake and say kind of enjoyment for enjoyment's sake, and basically this transcends morality. Almost you have kind of a Nietzschean sort of idea there. Oscar Wilde, he definitely latches onto that whole art for art's sake thing and a lot of the elements of the decadent movement and such. But he's also, he also really prioritizes wit and just being witty and sharp. I mean, the Victorians definitely had satire and wit, but they typically thought it needed to be employed for moral reasons, like to show, like Charles Dickens showing how bad boarding schools are, so you get the boarding school reforms and stuff like that. But Wilde, it's more seems like it's just for entertainment and for enjoyment purposes, and he actually makes fun of the Victorian quote unquote earnestness that he makes a play that's called The Importance of Being Earnest, that just straight up makes fun of the whole thing. And so he thinks that basically we should enjoy art for its own sake and not feel like we have to have any message for it in it and such like that. So all of that's pretty impactful on the later modernist movement. So let's talk about some ideals of modernism now. Pretty central to it is this idea that what has held society together no longer does, and we need to find a new center that holds. That's actually a quote from a poem by William Butler Yeats called The Second Coming. That's written kind of, I think, 1920 or so. But it says things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And he's kind of looking around at the kind of convulsions that society is going through. And this idea that society really has fragmented. We no longer have a common purpose, a common thing that's motivating us, and we all just seem to be stuck in wars that we can't end and not really knowing how to do society anymore and such. And so you have this idea of self-discovery that, okay, if society makes no sense and we can't really find our guidance from there, then maybe the human just needs to look within themselves to find sort of their inner purpose and goal in society. That part, even though a lot of modernism is very kind of consciously anti-romantic, the whole self-discovery thing, it's kind of right out of the romantic playbook, if you will, if you remember what we said about that. And also this idea of the human against society, that society is meaningless and makes no sense, and so we have to kind of find our own way against it individually. Moral uncertainty. We're not so sure what's right, wrong, good, or bad, and we don't have to write from the sense of certainty. We can kind of just like be okay with that uncertainty in our literature. And meaning as being something more created than inherent. This really shows up more so and even more so in postmodernism, but it's definitely there in modernism as well. The influence of a lot of the different ideologies. There's very consciously Marxist writers. There's very consciously, well, I won't say Nazi per se, but that type of thought writers and others like that that are influenced pretty strongly by some of these different ideologies. The sense of alienation that basically we don't really fit here, and we're not really sure how we work in the bigger picture here. And then, of course, the urban, this is a time of mass urbanization. Lots of people are moving to the cities, and the cities are really ballooning in size, and the sense of, being part of a system that's kind of unthinking and unfeeling, it highlights a lot of that. And also the mundane, like you have this sense of, literature can sometimes even be about like the boring and the uninteresting, as well as it doesn't always have to talk about those topics. I mean, you see that before then too, but that becomes pretty prominent in a lot of literature at the time. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the forms that literary modernism takes, as far as like some of the style and organization. So this uncertainty of truth that is pretty central to a lot of modernism, this desire for this new sort of central truth to hold things together, oftentimes that's explored through these very fractured narratives. You see that, as you know, the slide here indicates, in collages and artwork, where you've got these kind of bits of stuff that are just sort of pasted together in a seemingly haphazard fashion and such. But it shows up in literature with these narratives such as, say, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where you have like this narrative of this man and woman who are, it seems to build up with this heavy classical illusion. And what's the great big payoff? I guess we should go out and drive around a little bit and then, come home. And then it just sort of shifts and you're in a bar and there's this woman gossiping about this other woman who had an abortion and stuff like that. And it just switches from narrative to narrative. And there's all these deep, dense chunks of illusion that are just sat next to each other without really telling you why they're there, and you sort of have to draw the connections. Of course, that goes, so just a lot of juxtaposition without, once again, explanation. Unreliable narrators, there's this, once again, this feeling that truth is uncertain. So you get a lot of perspective, writing from the perspective of someone that, do they really know what they're saying? Are they lying to me? Or maybe they're just misinformed, or maybe they're just really biased. Now that's been in literature for a while, but it really comes to the fore in many ways during the modernist era. Lots of symbolism. Modernist writing is typically uses a ton of symbolism, and they like it really trimmed down and not explained. So when I say, well, trimmed down, I mean it could be pretty flowery, but it's like, the symbol is there and it's vivid, and they're not going to tell you what it means. You're going to have to draw your own conclusions, and it probably means 20 things at the same time, some of which might seem to be contradictory, but that's the way modernist literature works. It tends to be heavily symbolic. They actually move away from realism at this time in many ways, because there's this distrust in that, there's the real world that we can be really sure of, and kind of that goes the whole uncertainty of truth thing. A lot of genre blurring. I mentioned The Wasteland earlier. A lot of parts of that read pretty prosy. It's an amazingly beautiful poem, and there are some very poetic in the traditional sense parts, but some of it sound very prosy. And then you've got stuff like the prose of James Joyce that oftentimes sounds very poetic. So, and not just there, you see all these genres, they're experimenting with, mixed media that sort of blends different genres and stuff. Keep in mind, this is when film is really coming to the fore as well. And so a lot of these new narratives are being explored in film also. Modernist literature a lot of times, very commonly, uses a lot of illusions. And it can be very illusion dense, even in areas that seem kind of strange. For example, probably one of the best known, most celebrated modernist works is James Joyce's Ulysses. And on the surface of it, it's this relatively normal middle-class Dubliner that's just kind of walking around town, like going and eating at this cafe and meeting up with a friend of his son, and just kind of seemingly wandering around aimlessly. However, it's called Ulysses, which is, the Latin form of Odysseus, and the whole thing is structured on more or less beat for beat a parallels with Homer's Odyssey, and there's tons of allusions all over the place. So allusions are really big in modernism, and you kind of almost have to have an encyclopedic knowledge to pick up on a lot of them in, say, like Ulysses or The Wasteland or something like that. So, and I should also point out that modernist literature a lot of times becomes a lot more difficult. So you really see, this has always existed to some extent, but you really see this kind of bifurcation of popular literature and literature for the highly educated. that happens during this time where, if you're going to get through the wasteland, it's kind of in itself a education on how to appreciate a pretty difficult poem. And if you're going to read Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, let's just say I have a master's degree in English. I've read a lot of books. I've never gotten more than about 3 pages through Finnegan's Wake. And one day maybe I'll get there, but it's incredibly difficult for me, and such. So, modernist literature, a lot of it becomes, well, let's just say it expects a lot more out of the reader than was more common than, say, some of Charles Dickens' novels or Leo Tolstoy's or some of those back kind of in the Victorian era. Stream of consciousness, speaking of novels, and James Joyce, stream of consciousness becomes a very popular technique. Now, this is a way where the viewpoint, instead of being, John went over there and sat down, and then John thought this. It's more, oh, over there, sit down. Desk here. Desk is sort of like, so you're almost getting the camera from inside John's skull, where it's trying to replicate this sort of stream of both data from the senses, what John is seeing, and then also what his impressions and thoughts and memories all sort of kind of jumbled together, the way that our actual lived experience is to some extent, as opposed to more traditional narratives. It's more like someone telling their story rather than you're getting the actual in the skull perspective of them being in that moment. So Joyce was a very prominent writer that used that. Virginia Woolf as well, and then in America, William Faulkner uses this a lot. I mean, it's pretty commonly used by a lot of people, but those are some of the writers in which it's most prominent. And so, speaking of writers, let's talk about some of the major figures in English language modernism. At least there's plenty of others in other languages and cultures too, but since this is a British literature or English literature class, we'll focus mostly on this. Okay, so among the poets, I already mentioned these first two. William Butler Yeats. He's an Irish poet. He's older than the others on this that are listed here, and he actually starts writing back in the late 1870s, and he's writing poetry pretty consistently all the way up to his death, which I believe was 1938. And so he kind of undergoes several different reinventions as a poet, where his poetry style, although definitely you can tell it's still Yeats, it changes pretty dramatically several times. And the influence of a lot of the modernist thinkers and modernist movement in poetry kind of causes him to reinvent himself as a modernist poet. So his poems are known for deep use of symbolism, as well as just this really beautiful musicality and kind of almost dreamlike imagery and stuff. And so he's an amazing poet. T.S. Eliot, probably no more characteristically modernist poet exists than T.S. Eliot. He's hugely influential on all sorts of other people, including Yeats and these other people and the other people I'm listing here. But Eliot is an American. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, I think, and goes to Harvard, but then moves across the pond to the UK and becomes a British subject. And so he's kind of he sort of bridges the Atlantic, and he's both the Americans and the British claim him as one of their own, and he's known for huge amounts of allusions, deep symbolism, and also poetry that deals with a lot of the sense of despair and stuff like that. He undergoes a religious conversion in the early 1930s and becomes politically and religiously very conservative, while his poetry, on the other hand, is not conservative. I mean, his poetry is very experimental and trying out new forms. And in many ways, he breaks with a lot of the tradition of previous poetry and brings in a lot of new ideas into what makes poetry poetry. W.H. Auden is a little after Eliot, but he's kind of does the opposite. He's a British writer who moves to America. His poems are known for being really ironic and kind of having the sense of detachment to them, which is, can be a little hard to get used to if you're used to, poetry that's very emotionally involved. But they're highly polished and very beautiful in their own way. It's just, they tend to take the viewpoint of a somewhat detached observer who is, interested in what he's seeing, but is also kind of using this very kind of ironic and cool tone. And Auden, he lives into the 1970s, and so, he's kind of a later modernist in a lot of ways. Marion Moore, an American poet who is known, among other things, for her very densely, very carefully polished poetry. She's really an amazing poet when, talking about kind of like putting you in the middle of an experience and sort of kind of feeling from the inside what it's like to be a fish in the sea or something like that. So it's just, beautiful imagery and stuff. Really kind of at the very end of this period, and some people would call kind of when postmodernism is kind of coming to the fore, is Allen Ginsberg. He's an American writer and kind of proto-hippie sort of fellow. So he's writing at this during this time period. His best known work is his lengthy poem Howl, which is beautiful and amazing, and also something that is not school appropriate. I'll put it that way. So yeah, so he also does a kind of a lot of experimentation with drugs and alternate lifestyles and things like that too. Among the novelists, I've already mentioned Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, both of which are known for heavy use of the stream of consciousness technique and also just kind of like really tightly, carefully precise word for word writing and such. Joseph Conrad, English is his fourth language, and he still managed to be an absolute master of English prose. Probably his best known work is Heart of Darkness, which is kind of a critique of imperialism, while some people would later claim kind of assuming too much of that viewpoint too. So it's it's a little bit controversial in some ways, but just as far as tightness of prose, deep symbolism, and as well as a fairly bleak picture of humanity. It's really unique. Ernest Hemingway has a huge impact on later prose writers. Hemingway is kind of the master of juxtaposition. He'll put, his prose is typically pretty dry and doesn't tell you a lot about what the people are thinking or feeling. It just kind of states things and what's not said is very often as important as what is. Tends to use at least deceptively, at least on the surface, deceptively simple prose and such, but with tons of kind of stuff going on behind the scenes. Among the playwrights, Shaw's probably the most influential playwright of this time, George Bernard Shaw. He starts writing in the 1880s, and he's still writing plays and screenplays and stuff all the way till he dies in 1950. So he's got a very long, productive career. His plays a lot of times deal with social problems. He was a socialist and very politically active, and he deals with a lot of social issues that he wants to bring notice to. But he's also known for kind of wit and satire and ironies. Most of his plays are comedies, and that really shows through. And then finally, Samuel Beckett's another playwright later on, who's known, well, probably his best known is Waiting for Godot, which is a play that's, like a lot of his plays, deal with absurdism and the loss of meaning, and they're definitely not comedies overall. I mean, although they have comedic elements to them and such. So anyway, and that wraps up the presentation. So we'll talk about this more in class. See y'all then.